Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Community Solar. My name is Cody. I'll be your moderator today. This webinar will last for 3 hours and 15 minutes, and we do have some notes to cover before we begin. Please be sure to be logged onto the webinar through your own individual connection so that we can accurately prove attendance in the event that you or Half Moon are audited. Furthermore, we require individual connections so that you are able to access the quiz at the end of the webinar. The quiz will automatically appear on your screen after I end the webinar. If you are unable to successfully submit the quiz, you can access the quiz via the thank you or follow-up email that is sent about an hour after the webinar has ended. Certificates will be issued for today's webinar. If you did not successfully submit the quiz after attending the webinar, please be sure to complete the quiz through the thank you or follow-up email. The certificates will be sent via email in PDF form, and if you need your certificate sooner, please reply back to any emails you have received regarding these seminars or call into our office. We will be taking questions throughout today's webinar. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the questions area of the GoToWebinar panel. And with that, I will hand it over to our speaker today, Mr. John Ross Cromer. He is a master electrician with a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and he is a NAB CEP certified PV installer. Mr. Cromer is also the author of Solar Power Design and Development, an Introduction to Rooftop Solar. Take it away, JR.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I already see we have our first question that says not getting any audio with Cheryl. So is anyone else having any of that issue with no audio? And other people hear me all right? I suppose that problem will take care of itself anyway. I don't see any other complaints. So Cody, just take note of that comment. There's one student who's having audio issues. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Community Solar Program. This is kind of an interesting topic to me. Community solar has been a buzzword more so in years, just a couple of years ago. And nowadays, it's useful to know. It sounds kind of odd, but you might be in a position down the road in order to provide funding for a large rooftop solar project, like on a convention center or in a commercial setting. You may not want to have the owner of that asset provide the financing of that asset. And what we'll learn today, by the end of the day, is that community solar is a pretty interesting tool for financing a solar project, in the sense that you get a lot of interested participants who are willing to put up the cash for a solar project with very limited expectations for return on investment. And so while my view on community solar might be a little bit different than others in the industry, I view community solar as kind of like the ending point for any utility scale or even large rooftop commercial project, in the sense that typically your project financiers want a high return on investment for their project, and your community solar participants, out of all solar participants, have the least expectation of financial return. And so if you add a community solar layer to your solar project at the very end, it adds an additional opportunity for profitability for the original project investors, and also ultimately transfers ownership of the project to the public, which brings everybody on board and kind of resolves this consumer-owned solar versus utility scale solar kind of conundrum that we'll get into as more and more renewables come into the grid. I mean, if we just kind of put on our future vision and we go to a 100% renewable grid, we'll still have this problem of what's the right relationship between utility scale solar and consumer-owned solar, and the right community solar platform for a utility will keep them in the market without losing all that market share to consumer-owned solar, while also appeasing the general public. So if you understand community solar and you think you can put together a community solar program for your project, ultimately what it will do is allow you to get everybody under the same tent, and also add some profitability for the original developers. So it's definitely something that we shouldn't just kind of ignore as a novelty. Instead, what we need to do is kind of figure out the just fundamentals of green energy transactions, how they work, why people participate in green energy programs voluntarily, and then what the economics of utility scale of community solar programs look like, so that we can develop our own community solar program. So, this is just one course of many that we do for Half Moon. My website is actually called Community Solar. It's a .solar domain name. It's www.community.solar. And if you have any follow-up questions after class about the program content, feel free to send me an email. For Half Moon students, I do not mind providing copies of slides. I also provide recordings of the presentations. So, just so you know, after this program, the content for you doesn't just vanish. You still have access to it. If you send me an email, it's john@community.solar. We kind of got into my background already. So let's just go ahead and define community solar. SEIA, which is probably the largest solar energy kind of trade organization or group organization, defines community solar as any shared arrangement which allows multiple customers to combine investments to provide green power. And then I think that the most important term in this whole definition is this and or part right here. We're trying to provide renewable power and or financial benefit from one local solar array. And what that implies is that maybe some of the people who are involved in community solar aren't really receiving any financial benefit. They're just providing, they're just getting the renewable power. So maybe they're in a break-even proposition. Maybe they're actually increasing their electric bill slightly, just to see this local power plant get developed. So I think that is probably the most fascinating and or combination I've ever seen, where it says, hey, we're supporting solar. We're supporting solar financially. We're bringing solar to the grid, but maybe not everyone in the group is going to get the financial benefit of solar, and maybe everyone's okay with that. That's kind of an odd concept, especially for consumer-owned solar. And I guess utility scale solar, both sides, they want an economic return. But what we're just right off the bat, the definition of community solar, what we're hinting at is maybe the economic return on investment isn't there for all parties in the arrangement. And perhaps more interesting is that maybe the parties who are not getting the financial benefit are still okay with, what they're getting. Cody, Cheryl's still not getting audio, so maybe she needs to call in, or someone needs to give her a call and figure out what's going on. All right. I think that this article in Green Tech Media really hits the nail on the head, where they say that community solar programs throughout the country are as varied as barbecue styles. And the reason for that is we have this patchwork quilt of electric policy throughout the country. Some grids are regulated, some grids are deregulated, and the flavor of your community solar program is going to depend on the kind of grid regulation you have going on in your community. So we're going to talk about grid regulation, deregulated grids, regulated grids, to understand their fundamentals so that we can take that into account when we develop our community solar project. And while this slide here may seem a little bit dated in 2014, I think it really points out kind of where the push for community solar was coming from. And so we're going to look at what people back in 2014, where they thought the solar market was going, and what was going to drive this big push for community solar. Not everything in this study played out, as we'll learn. And then just another kind of side note is the National Renewable Energy Labs has produced dozens of these, multi-page reports. Some of them are 100 pages or more on renewables, on various topics in the renewable industry. And so, I always find these documents very useful and well written. So if you just Google like National Renewable Energy Labs Solar PDF, you'll get tons and tons of nice reports to read through on the solar industry. So here's a map. These are figures coming from that report back in 2014 of states with community solar projects and then states that had community solar legislation. And what we just see from this map is there's plenty of states that have community solar projects without any community solar legislation on the books. Now, the states that have a lot of community solar projects, many of them have community solar legislation, but not all of them. And so the question is is it better to be proactive, or can you even be proactive with your community solar program? Or do you have to wait for state legislation to allow you to move forward? And what we generally see is that projects will follow legislation. So, Massachusetts passes a community solar law, and it takes a few years for Massachusetts to develop a community solar project. Here's Maine, and then we see, Maine pop up a few years later. We also see some states like Colorado getting into the game a couple years ahead of time, in this case, a year ahead of time. And maybe the incentive to do that is if a utility develops a community solar program ahead of any legislation, their expertise is going to be called on by the Public Service Commission when any community solar legislation is drafted. Again, this is from studies in 2014 and 2015, and the what's critical about these studies is that they didn't think the tax credit would be extended back in 2000, even early 2015. The 30% tax credit for solar was set to expire, just vanish, go away at the end of 2016. And so when you assume that the tax credit expires at the end of 2016, they were predicting kind of a leveling off in the market in rooftop solar. And what they were seeing as the replacement is that the utility scale market would continue to grow, mainly due to economies of scale. It's much cheaper. You get into $1 a watt installs at the utility scale. I'm about the cheapest residential installer I know, and I'm doing a project right now, a 15 kilowatt, very straightforward residential project for about $1.75 a watt. And so even if, the cheapest residential quotes you can find are still 70, 80% higher than what utility scale projects are being installed for. So the line of thinking was the tax credit would go away. Utility scale solar is still pretty cheap. And because of those economies of scale, the utility scale solar market would continue to grow, whereas the consumer owned solar market after the tax credit would level off. Now, personally, I don't agree with that assessment. I think whenever we talk about utility scale projects and economies of scale, what it really neglects is the fact that when you put solar on a roof, you get a higher generation rate, you get a higher effective value of your solar array. So if you have a utility scale program that only pays 4, 5, 6 cents a kilowatt hour for the electricity, and then you have in the same grid a rooftop solar array that pays 11, 12, or 13 cents a kilowatt hour for the electricity or more, then you don't really have much advantage to those utility scale economies of scale. In fact, you could go and develop this utility scale solar project, and already there are policy wonks saying, hey, consumer owned solar, rooftop solar could put the utility scale market out of business, and they're really talking about traditional power plants versus renewable power plants. But if everyone in the market goes off grid, even these utility scale solar plants could not make their return on investment if they don't have any customers. That actually will play into why you would do a community solar project, which is to contract customers into 20-year power purchase agreements over the long term and provide risk mitigation. And so maybe there's a happy medium where you do a utility scale project and you have a community solar program that pays a little bit more than avoided cost, or a little bit more than what a utility scale developer would normally be paid, in order to entice the consumer who has the choice between doing the community solar program or putting solar on their own rooftop and not participating in the system anymore. You give them something halfway in between as the community solar option, so that the utility or the grid operator doesn't completely get boxed out of the market by distributed renewables. But really, that's more exposition. The primary point of this slide was to say, hey, back in 2014, 2015, the industry reports were predicting a leveling off of the growth of rooftop solar, but a continued growth in utility scale solar. And that's where the big push for community solar came, is can we do utility scale or large projects or off-site projects and provide that as the buy-in option to the consumer. Personally, I think that utility scale projects are more exposed to the tax credit than residential projects because there's slimmer margins in a utility scale project. So when you lose that 30% cash back incentive, you really start eating into the bottom line of the project, and not not just soft costs or margins. So the tax credit goes away, and the residential installer has to take a hard look at his costs and say, well, can I get down in price to still be on the market? Whereas the utility scale business model may not work at all anymore because they don't have that wiggle room to come down in their project costs. But you'll still have that basic economies of scale dilemma where a utility scale project can be installed cheaply than a residential project, and you also have the grid operator, the project developer, not wanting to lose their market to rooftop resources. There's other ways to involve the community in developing solar projects for discounts without having them directly own solar. Or if they're directly owning solar, they say, well, there's other ways to organize the community in this industry. So there's green power purchasing, and that's the kind of the big one, whether or not you bundle it with your electric rate plan or not. And so that would be signing up for your utilities green choice option on the electric bill. That could be a private transaction where Google says we're going to power all of our energy from that wind farm that's 500 miles away. Well, how does that happen? On some grids, it's you literally buy the wind farm project, plug it into the grid, and pay the transmission and distribution fees. That may or may not be virtual, and then you claim the energy. Another way to do it is to just buy the, for lack of a better term, and we'll define the term later, a renewable energy credit, which is kind of like a carbon credit or a cap and trade system where Google would say, okay, we're going to do 100% green power, but we're just going to buy our regular electricity, and then we'll go onto the third party voluntary carbon credit market and buy a whole bunch of carbon credits to apply against our account. So you can have bundled green power purchasing, or you can have, unbundled green power purchasing. There's also kind of Groupon style bulk purchasing. So the popular one is the Solarize movement. It's done at the local level. You have Solarize Rochester, Solarize Massachusetts, where the whole community gets behind adding solar to their property. And generally speaking, they all choose one installer and do all the projects at the same time in order to get volume discounting on their material purchasing. And it claims to be about a 20 to 30% discount over market rate projects, which I get. At the same time, I'm not really sure that that discount is something that an individual can't achieve on their own by just rolling up their sleeves and being very opportunistic, having a long project development schedule and then just waiting for the right sale on the solar modules to get the pricing you need. So, the Solarize movement is great, but I'm not sure if the long time it takes to bundle all the community members together to launch a bunch of projects is any better than the current business model of just competitive bidding. You also get solar bond purchasing or online investing. So every now and then, you might get Solar City offering some bonds in the company. There's another company called Mosaic that funds solar investments, and periodically they will offer the opportunity to buy bonds in the company that go to fund the investments. So we'll take a look at that. And then, of course, there's direct array ownership or leasing. When you think about it, a solar lease is kind of like a community solar project because it's one array and there's a host who has the array on their property, and then there's a third-party owner, and that third-party owner may be receiving the financial benefit, and the host may be saying, okay, well, I got the solar array, and maybe it's saving me money or maybe not. So maybe solar leasing could be defined by SIA's definition as a community solar project. It's definitely a different option. Okay, so what is a renewable energy credit? This is what cap and trade is effectively in the United States. So, like it or not, this is the policy. One renewable energy credit called a REC, it represents the environmental attributes of the energy. And so what they say is, well, we're on a shared electric grid. So our wind farm dumps energy into the grid. Our coal power plant dumps energy into the grid. And then all the electrons get kind of messed up in the middle. And so if I'm a customer that wants green power, I can't just draw the green electrons out into my grid. I get whatever that mixed up content is. So how do I facilitate a true green transaction? Well, the common method is to say, well, just dump all your electrons into the grid, transact electricity as you normally would without green energy being considered, and then have a separate transaction for the renewable energy attributes. So whoever owns it's like mineral rights. Whoever owns the mineral rights to your wind farm, whoever owns the renewable energy certificates to the wind farm is the one who gets to claim that they are green powered. Now, they're still receiving the same electricity from the grid that they would otherwise be receiving, but at the same time, there has been green energy dumped into the grid that perhaps deserves a higher value than emission-based energy. And so this renewable energy credit system is a kind of an imaginary or a fictitious or a paper transaction. And that's not necessarily to say it's a bad thing. I mean, buying stocks and bonds is a imaginary, fictitious paper transaction with very real results. And so so what this system is something that is kind of made up to facilitate very real transactions, but it's not perfect. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't like that idea that, you're just kind of making things up when I'm saying I'm generating renewable energy credits and you're buying renewable energy credits. It's like, it's not quite the same as saying my electricity came from that solar farm down the road. It's like I visited Lubbock, Texas, where there's tons of wind farms, and it's kind of neat at night to go around and look at all the street lights and think, hey, yeah, that electricity in those street lights is actually coming from the wind farm located right outside of town. Whereas a renewable energy credit, technically speaking, you might buy on the voluntary market a renewable energy credit that came from the whole other side of the country. So, you might be saying, oh, I'm green over in Idaho, but it's really Alabama where the green project is located and getting those benefits. But that's how most, like if you have a state green energy mandate, says X% of our electricity needs to be green, generally it's counted in renewable energy credits. If you have a utility that's selling you a green power plan, it's counted in renewable energy credits. So renewable energy credits at their most basic are a counting system or perhaps an accountability system. And basically, to generate a renewable energy credit, all you have to do is document your production from your green power generator to say, I generated 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity. I am the owner of one renewable energy credit. Who wants to buy it? And so it's a combination of producing the green energy and then documenting that production that creates your renewable energy certificate. So, if I live off grid and I buy a solar array and I have an inverter monitoring system, am I generating renewable energy credits? Yes, you are. Are you going to find a buyer for those renewable energy credits? Maybe, maybe not. Same thing with any other project. So they're often measured in megawatt hours, which is 1,000 kilowatt hours. So that's kind of the base unit. If you generate 1,000 kilowatt hours of green energy, you have one renewable energy credit. But in the event of a green power plan, where it's like you're buying $5 of renewable energy credits a month, or you're offsetting 100% of your electric bill a month, the renewable energy credits are metered and monitored in kilowatt hours. So, it's not just a hard and fast definition. One renewable energy credit is 1 megawatt hour. You can subdivide this stuff into kilowatt hour blocks. And then sometimes they say, okay, well, we're going to divide solar renewable energy credits from wind renewable energy credits. And maybe in our energy portfolio basket, we have a 2% solar mandate and a 5% wind mandate. And that, again, that'll kind of artificially manipulate the value of these renewable energy credits for better or worse. And generally, when you have a carve out for solar, it results in a higher market rate for solar. Um, historically. Historically, there's been more wind on the grid than solar, and so the solar renewable energy credit has had a higher value in the markets where the wind RECs are carved out or separated from the solar RECs. And so often solar RECs are called S RECs. There's the little S on top. And because this is kind of an artificial market, it's subject to massive price fluctuations. And we'll look at those later. I mean, so it can be very confusing for a customer. They look into a market, they're generally on the East Coast, where these solar renewable energy credits are worth over $100 a megawatt hour. In other words, over 10 cents a kilowatt hour. And you might have someone in Kansas saying, well, I only pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour for my electricity. So the solar renewable energy credit is worth, a substantial portion of, the solar renewable energy credit in New Jersey might be worth 2 to 3 to 4 times retail value of the electricity itself. But then just right across the state line in, Pennsylvania, you may not have artificially induced market for solar renewable energy credits, and so they may not be worth anything at all. And then that might not actually be true. It may be that there's voluntary buyers of those renewable energy credits in Pennsylvania that are paying an arm and a leg for renewable energy credits. They just don't know how to buy them from anyone else but the utility. And so, you might have generators of renewable energy credits in a community and buyers of renewable energy credits in a community, but they don't have the ability to connect to each other. Now let's just take a step back for a minute and look at our electric grid. We have this system where, we generally locate our power plants outside the city for a number of reasons. Any have to do with emissions. And then we push, from our high voltage transmission lines into our low voltage distribution lines and then into our home. In some of our solar classes, we talk about voltage potential being like a boulder sitting on top of a mountain, and then your home at lower voltage is down in the valley. And in order to push that electron from the nuclear plant all the way through the power lines down to your home, you got to go from high voltage to low voltage so that you can push that boulder all the way off the mountain and have it roll all the way down to the valley below and end up at the end of its line. In rural communities, sometimes they'll run their distribution grid at a little bit higher voltage, maybe 245 or 246 volts instead of 240, in order to push that electron a little bit further down the line. One kind of unique thing about solar plants is they're emissionless, and so they can be located on the distribution grid right down the road where you're driving by a field that's empty. You say, well, why can't we turn that into a solar farm? And so you might get community solar organizers coming together to say, hey, let's go and do the local power plant. And I guess where that's, to bring it back into our discussion, to date, a lot of these voluntary wind renewable energy transactions are occurring from wind farms that are located hundreds of miles away from the green energy buyer, from the green energy participant. And so we have this kind of fictitious system where the homeowner who wants to be green signs up for the utility green energy plan, and somewhere along the line, the utility is supposed to have an accounting system to say, well, we bought this many renewable energy credits from this wind farm, and we have this many green energy buyers, and it's supposed to all settle out. But how well is that system documented? If the solar farm is located 10 miles down the road from the customer can drive by it and say, "Hey, that's the project I support." And that might be a more real transaction than these fictitious renewable energy credits. And so even though, it's kind of odd, what we'll see in community solar is often that renewable energy credit claim does not end up with the homeowner. And so on a wind farm based renewable energy credit transaction, the homeowner is actually buying the mineral rights. The homeowner can go out there and say, "I am green. I am 100% green, 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 green." The community solar transactions are a little bit different. The homeowner participating in the community solar transaction may not be allowed to go out and say, "We're powered by renewables," because that claim of renewable energy credits will go to another power plant, be bought and sold on the secondary market to make this project a little bit more profit. But by and large, the state legislatures and the homeowners have said, "Hey, that's okay, because this is a more tangible system than the renewable energy credit transactions that we've had in years past." And so, in years past, we've had a lot of kind of concern over how to document these renewable energy credits to sell voluntary green energy and have this kind of virtual device feel real, how to make it feel real to the customer, and how to avoid double counting so that these virtual credits are not being sold to person A and sold to person B and sold to person C and sold to person D, and then also counting against some utility scale mandate. The concept of double counting is not that important in a community solar project, and often the real effect is that the renewable energy claim does get double counted, in the sense that the homeowner says, "I'm a community solar participant," and the power plant that needs the offsets also says, "I bought the renewable energy credits from that solar farm," but nobody cares about the double counting. And perhaps that's because it's something more tangible than buying your green energy credits from something that's 500 miles away from you. So let's talk about grid regulation. This is a regulated grid. Regulated grid structures are simple. Basically they say, okay, we can't have just free market capitalism in our electric grid, simply because what that results in is everyone running multiple sets of wires from power plants to customers, and it makes a literal tangled mess of power cables on our electric grid. Dozens of independent suppliers, it's going to be much more cost effective for society just to have one power line coming to the house, and not dozens and dozens of power lines like you get in third world countries, or perhaps parts of Mississippi where I'm located. So what we have in our electric grid is basically a monopoly that says, and sometimes the monopoly is divided up. In Mississippi, the monopolies all happen at the kind of distribution level, and not necessarily at the power generating aspect of it. It may be that the monopoly is prevented from owning any of the generation technology. So you might have a monopoly just for the distribution power line. And that makes a lot of sense. When there's a storm outage and it knocks down a bunch of power lines, you don't want chaos in trying to fix the power lines. So it's good to have a one coordinated kind of command center for the distribution lines. Similarly with high voltage power lines, you don't necessarily want a whole bunch of different companies all tapping into the same high voltage power lines all willy-nilly. So, you may want one regulatory structure owning, maintaining, approving the power lines. And then so you might get a bunch of independent power producers. Well, regulated grids usually are going to take that or will at least start out with something where it's just one power company for the whole kit caboodle. So this is like the Tennessee Valley Authority, where they will build and own power plants, and then they will, they actually kind of subdivide their distribution lines into little fiefdoms of electric cooperatives. But the electric cooperatives don't really have, it's weird. The TVA may not be the best example because the TVA says the electric cooperatives have the ability to choose their rate structures and stuff like that. But at the same time, the electric cooperatives must buy all their power from the TVA, and the TVA sets that price and then negotiates with independent power plant owners or develops their own power plants to support that effort. And so everyone's kind of locked in to the same system no matter what they say. But it's very regimented. So the TVA rolls out a solar program. They say all utility scale developers can get 5 cents a kilowatt hour for their solar electricity. And that's rolled out very seamlessly throughout the entire region. Or they say, we don't have net metering and we're not requiring our individual cooperatives to have net metering. And so none of the cooperatives have net metering in the TVA region. And so a regulated grid can be a very simple and easy and straightforward architecture for developing community solar. The power company may have a standard offer that says, we'll pay you this much for a utility scale solar project, and you can just plug it into the grid, and it's that simple. At the same time, if you have a regulated grid structure that is against solar, then it can be very difficult to do project development in that area because there's no options, there's no competition. And so Texas went through an energy crisis and they said, okay, we need to invite competition into this because all the little cooperatives around, they're not giving our consumers any choice. So one cooperative can say, I'm going to jack up my utility rates. And there is a check and balance against that with your Public Utility Commission. On my impression of public utility commissions is they're really not. I guess they're supposed to protect the public, but they're really trying to kind of streamline the electric development in the state. And so that will, even if they're there to kind of provide checks and balances for consumer protection, their interest is in furthering the economic development and the grid development, which means they do a lot. They mainly talk and get input from utility plant developers, grid operators, transmission operators, and it can make an individual consumer in some cases feel a little bit boxed out of that system. And sometimes the Public Utility Commission doesn't actually have all that much power. They might have the ability to set certain policies, but like in the case of Mississippi, the Public Utility Commission does not have the power to regulate the rates of the regulated grid. They defer that to the individual cooperatives, and so you have no consumer choice, and then the cooperative gets to set their own programs and policies, And really all the Public Utility Commission does is determine whether or not the cooperative has the ability to exist or not. And then if so, what the boundaries, what the regional characteristics of that cooperative are. And so, in some sense, a regulated grid is very clear and straightforward and common sense. In another sense, there's less flexibility in a regulated grid. It's like what the policy is what the policy is, and you might have very little ability to develop a solar project using your own business model. You'll have to defer to what the Public Utility Commission business model is. So Texas went and said, hey, we want consumer choice. We don't want just one electric cooperative setting the rate structures for an entire region. We want our service providers to have overlapping territories, and that will promote competition and help keep the price of energy low. At the same time, you still might not be able to go to a completely deregulated grid, because you still, no matter how you slice and dice the electric grid for competition, you still might want one grid operator maintaining the power line. So even on a deregulated grid, you still might have one company doing one specific role. And so this is what the Texas model resulted in for their regulated grids. They went from, a very simple regulated model to basically saying that if you're a vendor of electricity to a customer, you cannot own any generating assets. And you also cannot own the distribution rights or the transmission rights. And so you have to pick which one you want to be. Do you want to be a vendor of electricity to the customer? Do you want to maintain a monopoly for the distribution lines and have a little fiefdom? Well, if you do, your fiefdom is going to get smaller because you're just doing the distribution aspect. You're not, setting the rate structure. And so you might have a settlement process between the transmission company and the distribution company and the retail electric provider, but the retail electric provider is handling the customer interface. And there's a big debate on whether or not that actually results in cost savings for the customer or not. And I think that you could probably use the data to prove it one way or the other. Obviously, there's a lot more red tape in a system like this than there is in a system like this. The real kind of crisis, I think, is when you have a regulated grid where there's no customer choice, and then the customer ends up having less rights than they would on a deregulated grid where there's customer choice. I think that's the kind of the high level, is my regulated grid working? The answer would be yes if you're providing kind of regular retail price electricity to your customers. The answer might be no if your customers are getting worse rights than they would under open competition. And that comes back to the solar aspect in a very interesting way, to say that there's certain grids, and the trend is to be more this way rather than less this way. So it used to be that it was like the TVA that had a regulated grid and then just gave their customers very bad solar options. And it used to not be a problem in years past because the TVA had a special solar incentive program off to the side that kind of avoided the fact that the TVA does not have net metering. Avoided the fact that if you plug the solar array into your service panel and want to use it for backup power and batteries and stuff like that, the TVA would only pay you avoided costs for the outflow. There was no net metering in the TVA's grid. And just recently, Michigan and Connecticut have come back and said, you know what? Let's get rid of our net metering and let's kind of do what the TVA is doing with their no net metering and see how that works. And so there are regulated grids around the country where the customers get zero net metering and their outflow is bought at avoided cost. What I think is particularly interesting about Texas's model is that, say, in Houston, Texas, you have a customer who puts solar on their house, and there's no net metering mandate in Texas. And in fact, it's a little bit difficult to implement net metering on a deregulated grid because it's not the job of the retail power customer provider to buy power from their customer. In fact, they're prohibited from owning the assets. And it's like everyone's shoelaces get tied together and saying, well, that's not my job. My job is to only do this. When you have a regulated utility, those arguments fall a little bit more flat. But back to Houston, Texas, you can get retail electric providers who will give their solar customers not quite retail price net metering, but something that is, 60 to 70% of the retail value of electricity. It might be they might call it the energy charge and not the distribution fee. And they still go and pay the distribution company a little bit of money for that. But what's interesting is that in a deregulated market with no net metering, you have customers that have more solar, who receive more value for their solar production on site than what you get in regulated utilities that lack net metering, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority region, and now Connecticut and Michigan. And I think that really sets these regulated utilities up for a lawsuit to say they should be deregulated in the name of customer choice because the customers are receiving less rights, less value for their on-site solar than what they would get on a deregulated model. And it should be the other way around. When you're granting a monopoly to one company to do everything, some of that streamlined efficiency should trickle down to the customer in the form of better consumer rights. Otherwise, what did they create this monopoly for? To get worse rights than what they had previously. So that's kind of on a regulated grid. If you want to get net metering and have a very anti-consumer owned solar policy, it almost begs you to do community solar. So you can say, well, actually, we do solar. It's just not through net metering. We do solar through our community solar program. And so in that sense, the community solar program for a regulated utility provides a little bit of insurance against deregulation, but also allows that regulated utility to kind of control how solar comes to the market so that they don't see the consumer-owned solar market eating their business. So we have a question that says, define net metering. Here is your electric meter, and here is your solar array up on a rooftop, and here's your house that it's plugged into, and here is the electric grid. These are supposed to be power lines. It's a little confusing. And so net metering basically says, and it's the weird thing about net metering is that the definition of net metering in the US is completely different than the definition of net metering everywhere else in the world. Everywhere else in the world, the definition of net metering is essentially the right to interconnect your solar to the grid and then sell back that electricity at avoided cost. At 20 or 30% of retail value. Basically, the justification of that 20 to 30% is that is, the power company is going to have to buy their raw material for their electricity from somewhere. And so, net metering, you get the right to interconnect to the grid, and then maybe on top of that, the right to sell back at the avoided cost of business for the power company to go out and buy the raw material for their power. Instead, for the same price, they buy refined electricity and right at the distribution point. So in exchange for allowing these consumer-owned solar assets to be interconnected to the grid, the power company gets to make a lot of money off of that instantaneous outflow. So what net metering in the United States says is the value of that instantaneous outflow is set to the retail price of electricity. And again, there's controversy on the definition of retail price because, if a utility is charging you a flat rate of $15 a month and has a retail price of electricity of 12 cents a kilowatt hour, they could easily just change their rate structure and charge you a flat rate of $60 a month and have a retail price of 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And so, net metering laws in the United States, the spirit of the law is to get the customer something close to retail value for their outflow onto the grid. But it's a state by state law implemented by the Public Utility Commission. It's a pretty weak law. Some utility commissions apply it to everyone in the state. Others exempt the electric cooperatives to say, well, it's a little bit different transaction. But the point is, on a regulated grid, you might get customers that have less rights than on a deregulated grid, and the danger is that opens up the utility for an argument against deregulation. Some kind of interesting kind of conundrums that occur on a deregulated grid is you can get some inefficiency going on where, say in the battery market, it makes a lot of sense for a utility to go and put batteries along the distribution circuit. And so if we're going to go and do utility scale batteries, some great spots for utility scale batteries are like right here, right here, right here. So that if this part of the grid goes down, normally it triggers kind of a cascading effect where it takes out the whole distribution grid. And if the power outage is serious enough, sometimes it can take out the transmission grid and kind of escalates and escalates. And so it would make sense to put your batteries right on the distribution circuit. And if there's a power outage, isolate the distribution circuit so that these homes remain on while the power outage is being fixed locally. That can easily happen on a regulated grid. So I'm not trying to say that regulated grids are bad. There's opportunities for the regulated grid to be better for a consumer rather than worse. In fact, that's why we've had regulated grids. In fact, I kind of talk about the foibles of the TVA solar policy, but the TVA was created to bring everyone in the region under one company just to be able to provide affordable electricity to everyone. So there are reasons for grid regulation, and then you get into the opposite where you get into deregulation, and now that distribution company, they're no longer allowed to own power generating assets, and so it becomes a lot harder for that distribution company to go and put batteries onto those distribution circuits of the grid because by law they've been deregulated and they're prohibited from doing so. So now they have to kind of figure out leasing arrangements or easement arrangements to bring on private properties onto their distribution grid in order to get this new functionality to market. And the kind of what's been kind of weird is the way that the Texas market works is every year they issue new licenses for retail electric providers. And for the first few years, those new retail electric providers are given a discount off of their electricity that they purchase from the grid. And that makes the new retail electric providers artificially cheaper than the old ones. And so every couple of years, the customer will see their electric bill just jump up because the new retail electric provider has lost that discount. And so the customer has to more actively maintain their electric bill on a deregulated grid, perhaps, than on a regulated grid, where generally on a regulated grid, everyone gets kind of the same rate structure, for better or worse. Now, if I'm on a regulated grid, the price and cost of electricity is what it is. If I have a particularly hot day with high demand on the grid and I have to go contract for additional electricity to be wheeled onto the grid at a very high price, you just knuckle up and pay it. And, the next year you look at your rate structures and say, okay, well, that peak demand electricity was very expensive. And so you go and you ask the Public Utility Commission for additional rider for the ability to increase rates on everybody to overcome escalating costs. It's a very simple process. When you deregulate the market, you have to say, well, how do they balance their load? How do they determine, how much power they need, especially to accommodate the weather? I mean, today we had a hurricane or something, tropical storm, I don't know, kind of roll in to Mississippi. And so yesterday I was on a roof and it was hot as can be. We're sweating our butts off and everybody's air conditioner is going full blast too. Today the storm system rolls in and it's been raining all day and it's in the 80s. If it dries off, it'd be a nice time to be on the roof. Well, everyone's air conditioning systems are subdued. And so the weather on a day-to-day basis can completely change the whole market. In fact, renewables make that volatility, perhaps even more exacerbated, where it's like, well, if you have a lot of wind on your market and it's a hot day, you better hope that the wind is blowing so that you have the capacity from those wind power plants to supply your air conditioning loads. So you have to be more in tune with the weather. And on utility scale facilities, weather modeling is starting to become integrated into the design. Well, how on the deregulated market it works when you have various retail electric providers who are not the power generation companies, and then you have this transmission network and they need to be paid, and the distribution network and they need to be paid. How it happens is there's kind of like a stock market for buys and sells, except there's not much matching. It's not like you have one person saying, I have to have 10,000 shares at this price, otherwise I won't sell. You can have that in a stock market, but in there is a little bit more reality to energy market where, fundamentally you need that power delivered so that no one loses it. And so you're going to have some power plant with the capability to provide that power to the grid, shoving it into the grid so that the grid doesn't fail. And then they'll need to be paid. And so rather than the transaction not occurring, the transaction occurs without contract, and then they need to be paid. And so you might have long-term energy power purchase agreements between a customer and a wind farm with all the distribution and transmission fees negotiated and settled. but then that customer might have a volatile load, or the supplier of that power may not have all the generation capacity that they need to supply that load on a given day. And maybe the customer will never see the negotiations that go on behind the scenes, but this is what happens behind the scenes: is you have your long-term contracts, and then you have a day ahead market where everyone's looking at the weather and says, oh, well, this storm system came in, so I don't need to buy as much power as I need because my customers' loads are going to be low. So, I'm not going to, participate in the day ahead market today. And that in turn lowers the price of electricity for that day. Well, then what if the hurricane changes course and we don't get cloudy, rainy weather, but we get the hot, sunny weather that we're used to, and the day ahead buying opportunity has already passed? There's a real time market where the power company is that solar peaker or gas plant is pushing its power into the grid. And what the role of kind of the of the grid operator, or of the what the whole network, what the Public Utility Commission role is to establish a framework to making sure that the customers who delivered electricity to customers without having the buying capacity for it get charged for that power, and that the power generators who have the capacity to feed the grid but were not under contract for that power get paid for that power. And so there's a long-term market, a day-ahead market, a real-time market, and then even a settlement process for reconciling your real-time, what was delivered in real time versus what you contracted for. How does that balance out? And that's a whole career path in at these large scale utility companies. They'll have departments for buying and selling and managing that process. And so the reason why we kind of mentioned all that is, whether you're on a regulated grid or a deregulated grid, you may have different levels of flexibility for your project development. So if you're on a regulated grid, it might be as simple as going to the regulated grid monopoly and saying, well, what's your solar program? Because I want to develop a utility scale solar project. And they may come back and say, okay, well, we have a standing offer for 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you can make the project work at 5 cents a kilowatt hour, go ahead and build it. We'll buy all that electricity from you at 5 cents. Pretty straightforward stuff if it's available. Whereas if you have a deregulated market, there might not be any particular person that needs to give you the red light or green light for you to develop the project. You may just be able to go and build a 10 megawatt solar farm and plug it into the grid. And I mean, there might be an interconnection process where the transmission company has to say, okay, well, where you want to site it, we have the ability to take it. But it's not like the TVA saying, no, if you want to build a 10 megawatt project, you have to participate in our program. That's the only option. But so you might get more flexibility on a deregulated grid to develop a large scale project, but then the amount of expertise to say, well, my solar array only generates electricity during the day, so how am I going to supply my customer at night? You might have a different strategy. Your strategy might be to only participate, not to have any long-term customers, but only participate in the day-ahead markets or real-time settlement markets, and that might be very profitable for you, or it may bankrupt you in a year's time because you don't have any customers. So in some sense, it might be easier to develop a utility-scale solar project on a deregulated grid. but you would still need those customers. And so we'll see a lot of utility scale models community solar models are all about signing up the customers ahead of the project. Whereas you don't necessarily have that hurdle to jump over or figure out when you have a renewable standing offer from a regulated power company. So just some different rates. This is in Houston. We got Reliant. They have a free nights and weekends program where they say, okay, we're not going to charge you anything for your electricity during the weekend, and so you get free electricity on the weekends and maybe a little bit more expensive electricity during the week. And we want you to manage your electricity during the week. But on the weekend, you can do all the laundry you want because your electricity's free. And that's kind of reflective of this day ahead real time market and more flexibility in their pricing structures so that they can create a plan that is more specific to the real time electricity market than what. And it's not like the regulated companies can't do this stuff. It's just that they have less incentive to because they can kind of just smooth out the peaks and the lows under one rate structure. Whereas if you're a retail electric provider, you might want to create a rate structure that closely mimics the price of electricity for the customer because that's what's going to give them the best deal, and that's also going to what will get you the most customers. Now, what's kind of ironic in these deregulated markets is now the trend is aggregators, which basically take a whole bunch of customers and sign them up for one retail electric provider under a bulk discount. And so that's kind of funny too, because you might get all these customers lobbying for more choice than what they get on a regulated grid. And then they get that grid deregulation, and the trend is to turn around and form a bulk buying group, which is basically what the regulated grid was to begin with. I guess there's a little bit more flexibilities. So here's the same company on a deregulated grid with no net metering. And what it's saying is, we're going to give you a solar plan, and we're going to give you a sell back credit that is applied to your Reliant bill for the surplus, and it's going to be the same price you pay for electricity. Now that's kind of disingenuous because we have to remember this is a retail electric provider, and they say no on the free nights and weekends. They say this no energy charge, and I was just saying how that's free electricity. Well, that's not necessarily the whole truth. They might have no energy charge, but that energy charge might be from the power generation company. Now they say, hey, on nights and weekends, our power generators are throttled way down. They're producing way more power than what they need. And so in exchange for being able to sell the electricity during the week, they're going to give you free electricity during the weekend, yet you're still going to have to pay the transmission and distribution fees. And so they'll divide up the bill. You'll have an energy charge, you'll have a distribution charge, and even though this is being marketed as free energy on weekends, what they're actually saying is, for the portion of your bill that is the energy charge, which might be 60% of your bill, that's going to be free on nights and weekends, but you're still going to be paying the distribution and transmission fees. Similarly, on the Reliant Solar Sellback program, they're not required to give you retail price net metering. They're only required to give you avoided cost net metering, which is 20 to 30% of retail value. But instead, they're going to give you 60% of retail value under this plan in order to get the rest of your contract. I mean, a lot of solar customers do not have the property or rooftop space to put a solar array that'll offset 100% of the bill. And so they're trying to go after the remainder of the bill. And even if you are offsetting 100% of your energy use, there's still the meter fees to consider. And maybe what Reliant is saying is, you know what, there's going to be some solar customers that we don't make any money off of because they're offsetting 100% of their bill or maybe even more and getting more than avoided cost credit for it. And what this means is we're not going to make money off of every single one of our customers, but we're going to be the leader in our competitive market for solar owners because we're still going to make money off some of the solar owners. So we're going to brand ourselves as the company with the best rate structure for solar and get all the solar customers that way. And I guess that's kind of the main difference, I'd say, between what results on a regulated grid versus a deregulated grid is on a regulated grid, the utilities seem to be very obsessed with making money off of every single customer that's in their network, and the customer has no choice. Whereas on deregulated grids, with now that we have consumer-owned power generation assets, we see, perhaps a little bit more innovative thinking in this that says, well, we have to compete. Solar customers still pay electric bills, and so we're going to give them something more than what we're legally obligated to. That's not all the way up to retail price just to get all those solar customers into our network and rather than our competitors' network. And so it can get very frustrating in a regulated state where when you work in the solar industry, where the customers get less than what they do on a deregulated grid. It's like, come on, guys. I mean, if you were deregulated, your customers would be in a better position than what they are in now. So to maintain what are you going to do to maintain your monopoly? You can't just ignore your customers for that because eventually they'll show up at your door, demanding these things once they figure out how it all works. Obviously, monitoring is going to be important. So one thing we have to think about is, what is the level of accuracy in monitoring do we need to facilitate a community solar transaction? The utility meter is kind of the gold standard for monitoring. So however you monitor your solar project to participate in these state systems, you would think that you would have to have what's called utility grade monitoring or utility grade metering. The inverter system, where all the electricity flows from the array into the inverter and then out the inverter, it has an online monitor in it that counts every kilowatt hour that flows through the system. So is the monitor that's in your inverter good enough for monitoring and metering, whether it be your REC transaction or your community solar project or your outflow onto the grid? Now, generally, these monitors inside the inverters are 95 to 96% accurate, and the utility will say that their meters are, 99% accurate, 99.5% accurate. Some inverter companies will sell an upgraded monitoring system, which they call revenue grade monitoring or utility grade monitoring, to improve that accuracy just a little bit with, I guess, more expensive monitoring current transducers. But for documenting a renewable energy credit, what is actually needed? Well, really, all that's needed is a receipt. So here we have a electric bill from Nevada, and we see that their consumption is 1,036 kilowatt hours. So we have electric consumption of 1,036 kilowatt hours, and then we see this Nevada green energy rider option for 1,036 kilowatt hours. And wow, look, the price of electricity in Nevada is 10 cents a kilowatt hour, 9.098333. Let's just call it 10 cents. The renewable energy rider is 4 cents a kilowatt hour. So, and then there's all this other stuff. So let's just call it, we add up all this other stuff, and it's 0.1, 0.6, 0.1, 0.1, and then a 5% fee or whatever. So let's just call all this other stuff 1 penny, and then we'll call this 10 pennies. Basically what we see in this bill is an electric bill for 11 cents a kilowatt hour, and then the customer has added 4 cents a kilowatt hour just for the renewable energy credit. And if they wanted to go claim that they were powered by renewable energy, some facilities like to use that for marketing. Some townships like to use that for marketing. This customer, all they need is this electric bill to say, look, I paid for 1,036 kilowatt hours of green energy riders or renewable energy credits. And so my 1,036 kilowatt hours in the eyes of the law is 100% green. I'm a green facility. Even though I don't have solar on my rooftop, I'm a green facility because I have proof that I've purchased this many kilowatt hours. So what kind of proof do you need to generate these renewable energy credits? Do you need utility scale proof? Can you just use the standard equipment coming from your solar monitor? Well, let's take a look. It's going to vary state by state by state. So here in DC, so every state, even if they don't have an active high value renewable energy credit market, they'll still have a public service commission that will, you'll still have an interconnection application process with your utility for grid tied solar. And so if you want to count your renewable energy credits on the state system, you might not be on the state system. You might have a voluntary transaction between Amazon and your solar array that is completely voluntary and not subject to any state regulation for voluntary energy sales. But if you wanted to, sell your renewable energy credits to a power plant that is mandated to buy them by the state, in that case, you would use the state system. And so how do you log your renewable energy credits to sell them within the state system? Well, the requirements are going to vary state by state. So let's look at the DC requirements. Facilities under 10 kilowatts can simply estimate their generation based on PV watts. Well, geez, what does that mean? Now, that means I can pull up my PV watts solar calculator, and I'll put in Washington, DC. And if I wanted to do a 10 kilowatt solar array in Washington, DC, and it's going to be a roof mount system, and I'll just leave all this other stuff the same here. I click go. Well, here's my PV watts calculation, and my 10 kilowatt roof mount system is supposed to produce 13,622 kilowatt hours of production a year. And so I can go and register with my interconnection application. There's some process for registering my system with DC, and I don't even have to report my actual production. I don't even have to have, inverter level accuracy or proof. I can just send them my PV watts calculation and claim that I'm producing 13,622 kilowatt hours worth of renewable energy credits a year, or 13.6 megawatt hours worth of renewable energy credits a year. Whereas in Delaware, you have to have a revenue grade meter, so your inverter monitor may not be good enough. So just a PV watts printout is good enough in DC. You have to have a special meter in Delaware. Here in Massachusetts, where they have a very high value renewable energy credit market, it's more cleanly defined, and they say you have to have a revenue grade meter. In Maryland, you may not have an active renewable energy credit market. There's still some buyers, but they say, okay, well, just give us the PV watts calculation. North Carolina, it doesn't. It looks like over 10 kilowatts. So it's going to vary state by state. This is kind of interesting. In New Jersey, facilities under 10 kilowatts can use PV watts, and New Jersey has a very lucrative renewable energy credit market. And so, what we see is that not all states are like obsessed with revenue grade monitoring, as you might think, at least at the residential level. We're going to learn more about this system in a few slides. And so it says, well, does my state have a green energy mandate where power companies have to buy these carbon credits? It's not a nationwide cap and trade system, but every state will decide on if they're going to do cap and trade at the state level, and a surprising number of states do. This kind of has to do with the Commerce Clause and why there's no federal net metering, and why there's no federal utility company, for that matter, with federal electric rates as they do in other countries. Like Mexico has a completely nationalized power grid. They actually have net metering across the entire country. There's other things wrong with their power system, but maybe with solar and renewables, they'll start to modernize it and kind of take advantage of that streamlined infrastructure that they have. Well, here in the United States, we say, well, the federal government can only regulate interstate commerce if it also regulates that commerce between itself and foreign countries. And because we're not buying and selling electricity between foreign countries, and certainly agreements like the CPP or whatever get us closer to that, but we don't have global emissions agreements. And even with those global emissions agreements, it might allow the federal government to regulate those emissions within the state, but they're still not electricity transactions. And this is not just a renewable issue; it's more of a high level federal commerce issue. To learn more about it, they reference it. It's called the Commerce Clause, and it kind of is why we have this patchwork quilt of electric policy. The simple answer is this stuff has just been left to the states to determine for themselves. And so every state will have its own renewable energy goals. If you want to learn what your state's goals are, I'll go ahead and put it into the chat box. You can use the good old-fashioned, so there you go, Desire USA database. And so what I'll do is, maybe Mississippi's not the best state to use as the example. Why don't I go to Pennsylvania? And what I'm going to look for is the renewable portfolio or portfolio. So here we have, they don't call it renewable, but they call it the alternate energy portfolio standard. Most states will call it the renewable portfolio standard. And so we see that back in 2004, they said we want to go to 18% alternative energy by 2021. And there's going to be a PV minimum with tier 1, tier 2, and solar carve out. And you can get into what all this stuff actually means in the details. But, it might be that, who is this going to apply to? They're applying it to investor-owned utilities and retail suppliers of electricity. Usually when you get those terms, what that means is the co-ops in the state may not be applicable. But what this says is investor-owned utilities and retail suppliers of electricity in Pennsylvania, they do have to meet some minimum environmental standards, including a solar carve-out. And so if you're a utility and you're subject to those approvals, you may have to decide, am I going to build enough solar to meet this? Or am I going to participate in my state's renewable energy credit trading system and go and buy enough renewable energy credits to make up for it? And in fact, in some states, like, if you're a retail electric supplier and half of 0.5% of your supply has to be solar powered, and you're prohibited from being a power generator company, that would force you then to go and buy solar renewable energy credits. And depending on how many of those are, if there's a shortfall of those credits and you don't make your goal, then you'll get penalized. And so depending on what the renewable portfolio standard penalty is, and depending on what the supply of those renewable energy credits are, what that creates is a volatile market state by state that determines what solar renewable energy credit pricing is in your state. And so throughout the entire country, these renewable energy credit pricings, they can be worthless. You might have a state that says, oh yeah, we have a goal to be 10% green by 2020, but nothing's going to happen if you don't make it. Kind of the fuzzy chair of penalties. In other states, the penalties are like a guillotine. You really get penalized if you don't make it. And so that drives up the price of these solar renewable energy credits. And it might be that the requirements ratchet up each year. So even though the solar market grows, the price of the renewable energy credits remain high. And so we can see in DC and New Jersey and Massachusetts, kind of northeast coast states, you get into some pretty crazy solar renewable energy credit prices, which are above retail price of electricity. But their peers, like in Pennsylvania, there's a solar renewable energy credit market, but the value of the solar renewable energy credit is quite low. So generally, you aren't going to your state website and trading these with the power companies on your own. Generally, you're going to go and determine the value on your own. And a question, well, what about Arizona? Here we are in Arizona for the Desire website. I don't see a renewable portfolio standard for Arizona, although most states have them. So when I'm searching Desire, what I'm going to do is just switch to the Arizona laws. and kind of here's the renewable energy standard. So that's another term for it, is what's your renewable energy standard. And so they're going for 15% by 2025. This is interesting. I haven't seen this before. Distributed generation where half of it has to be from residential and the other half from non-residential, non-utility. So that's innovative. I've never seen that before. I do like that. Um, so what we can see here is the escalators are being defined too. So generally, if you want to trade your solar renewable energy credits, you're not doing this on your own. A power company isn't interested in just buying a handful of renewable energy credits. Although if your project was large enough, you could perhaps command a little bit, avoid the broker and get a little bit more. But not trying to promote this company, but they have been around a long time and they published their values online. So, SREC Trade, you go into their solar markets and this is a company that's really only interested in participating in markets that have high value RECs. And so we can see, well, most of the country, the REC markets really have never gotten off the ground. But if you're in, say, Massachusetts, you can go and see what the prices of Massachusetts renewable energy credits are, and they're still being bought and sold for between 280 to 380, between 28 cents and 38 cents a kilowatt hour in Massachusetts. We go into Pennsylvania. I'm not sure they're, here's the market rate. Instead of being $350, it's $8. So it's a huge pricing swing. And then if you're not on this map, your renewable energy credits are probably less than $10, and they might even be substantially less than $10. So let's continue our journey into understanding renewable energy credit pricing, see where we end up. Green power purchasing is quite popular. 2% of all electricity sales are voluntary green power purchasing, where customers are signing up for green energy plans even though they don't have to. Which I think is pretty admirable of those customers. So, even if, what I would say, Alabama Power right now, they're being sued for their solar discriminatory fees. But even Alabama Power, which I guess you could use that to portray them as an anti-solar utility, well, they'll still have a green power option for customers to sign up for. You go into the brass tacks of their program, and it says you're going to be billed for a REC purchase, and each REC is $15, and it's going to be billed at $1.25 per month for 12 months. So Alabama Power's green power option is you call us and you tell us how many RECs you want to buy, and we'll prorate it throughout the entire year and sell them to you for $15 a REC. Okay. So even the anti-solar utilities are selling voluntary green power to their customers. And what I think is kind of interesting is, okay, Alabama Power is selling green power for $15 of renewable energy credit. One renewable energy credit is 1,000 kilowatt hours. And so their rider, if you wanted to go 100% green, you would be increasing your electric bill by 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour, which is, about 15% in Alabama. Now in Alabama, they're saying you don't have to do 100% of your bill. You could do 1% of your bill if you really wanted to, $15 over the entire year. So even though you're buying the renewable energy credit at a penny and a half a kilowatt hour, because it would increase your bill by 15% if you did buy 100%. If you only went for a 1% option, you're not even going to see the difference, and you're still supporting the environment for whatever that's worth. Well, we go to Indianapolis Power and Light, and you go and read their rate riders and say, well, how much are they charging? Here they have a Rider 21 Green Power Initiative, which can be applied to their residential rate structure or any other residential rate structure. And going into the brass tacks of it, what we see is the green power rate here is it can be 25%, 50%, or 100% of the bill, and it's going to be billed at, there's two zeros there, 0.001 cent a kilowatt hour. And so what we have is a situation where Alabama Power is charging their customers 1.5 cents a renewable energy credit, and Indianapolis Power and Light is charging their customers 10% of that, even less. So what does that mean? Like, why is the renewable energy credit so comparatively expensive to the customer in Alabama versus in Indiana? And really what I'm trying to do with this is just to set up the renewable energy credit transaction as to be something that's kind of outdated and obsolete compared to community solar. So don't get too worked up by all of this. But, this is just, there's a concept called REC retirement, which basically says that, hey, look, if you're going to go and claim these RECs, it has to be fully retired in order for someone to claim it. And that's basically says, there's no double counting. So, if the same renewable energy credit is sold by one party to more than one party, that would be double counting. That's when the same REC is used by a power company to meet one of these renewable portfolio mandates that we just saw, and then it's also sold to a customer as a green power product, that would be double counting. And so there's an organization called Green E that kind of really got out in front of all this and said, we'll create the standards for voluntary REC trading. And you can go to their website and download the Green E National Standard. And the reason why I mention this is that federal buildings must buy renewable energy credits. And while they don't require the Green E standard, they require a Green E standard or equivalent. And so, we've had over the years past, as these renewable energy credit systems have gotten off the ground, some guidance issued on what constitutes double counting. And, it's pretty obvious, if two parties are claiming the same green energy value, that's double counting. In fact, historically, when the utilities were providing solar incentives to their customers over the last decade and a half, the customer, in order to get that check from the utility, would have to sign a contract that says, I'm giving my renewable energy credits over to the utility, and I'm not allowed to say that I'm powered by renewable energy, even though I have a solar array right on top of my house. So because I've sold the mineral rights to my solar array, the green credits to my solar array, I can no longer legally claim to be green powered. And so you would get guidance, right on the TVA website. It says, if you participate in our solar incentive program, you can say all these things. You can say, we support local renewable power. You can say we increase renewables by selling all of our renewable electricity to the TVA, but you can't say that you're powered by renewables even though there's a solar array right on top of your house, because that would be double counting, because the TVA is using those green credits to be counted elsewhere. So renewable energy credits are really weird in the sense that you could be claiming to be green powered even though the power plant might be 1,000 miles away, or you could be prohibited from claiming that you're green powered even though the green power is right on top of your roof. There's just something that doesn't sit in the and common sense of that. But maybe that is necessary for these kind of paper transactions and for the value of that greenness or emissionlessness to come to market. But the reality is it creates a market where renewable energy credit pricing is all over the board, not talking about New Jersey and Massachusetts, but talking about Arizona and Indiana. What we see is that residential customers are willing to pay up to 4 cents a kilowatt hour for these credits. And then here would be Indianapolis Power and Light customers at 0.1 cents. Here's that Nevada example at 0.4 cents. And Alabama Power is kind of squarely in the middle of the pack at 1.5 cents. And you get a similar spread for residential customers too. And what we also see is somewhat of a trend where the cheaper the renewable energy credit gets, the higher the volume is. But that's not necessarily true, completely true either. We get limited buyers at low prices, and then we also get some buyers at high prices. And then you get the utility scale market, where if I'm in the business, the wholesale market, if I'm in the business of buying and selling RECs, what is the average premium that I, as a utility who needs these RECs for my state level mandate, what do I end up paying? How expensive are these renewable portfolio mandates? And simply put, the average for renewable energy credits outside of those very expensive Northeast Coast markets, the renewable energy credits are almost worthless. I mean, the average premium is less than 1/10 of a cent a kilowatt hour. And so if you're paying 11 or 12 cents for your electricity, the green energy mandates are less than 1% of your electric bill. Well, that also begs the question, if the utility is selling the renewable energy credits for a penny and a half, and they're only buying the credits for 1/10 of a penny, aren't they making a heck of a lot of profit on that voluntary renewable energy transaction? So if I'm Alabama Power and I have the ability to buy what we see with Indianapolis Power is they buy the renewable energy credits for 1/10 of a penny, and they go and sell them to their customers at 1/10 of a penny. And they say, okay, well, there's a lot of wind in our area. We're buying all this wind power. We get the renewable energy credits along with it. We have too much of it. So if you want to buy these renewable energy credits from us, we'll sell them to you at cost. And so everyone can sign up for the green energy plan if they want to, and they can be 100% wind powered because we have so many of these surplus credits available. And the why do you get surplus credits? Well, it's because the mandates are like a post that you have to jump over, but the post is only 6 inches off the ground. These mandates in the states where the renewable energy credits are worthless are generally incredibly easy to meet, or the penalties are incredibly non-existent or cheap to pay. One or the two, maybe both. And so, generally speaking, you'll have the renewable generators supplying far more than what the state mandate is, and that creates a surplus of these credits, which means they're very cheap. And so what you have is, say, Indianapolis Power and Light kind of passing forward those credits at market rate, and then Alabama Power coming back and saying, well, wait a minute, I still have, even though I can buy the credits for $1 a megawatt hour, I have customers willing to pay $15 a megawatt hour for them. So I'm going to sell it to them at that price. And what that means, you look at the average retail price to a consumer for renewable energy credits being a penny, 1.7 cents a kilowatt hour. And then you have the average in the same year, the average price of the green credit being a tenth of a cent a kilowatt hour to the utility. What that means is that out of all of the average green power voluntary pricing program sold to a customer in 2014, only 5 cents out of every dollar actually ended up at a green power project. In other words, these green energy riders that are voluntary are one of the most profitable products that a utility can sell. In fact, I would argue that so much of the profit goes to the utility, whose bottom line is a business, no matter how you cut it. The bottom line, a utility's business is to sell electricity and dump a bunch of emissions into the atmosphere. And here you have a environmental do-gooder handing them $1 for a green project, and only 5 cents ends up at the project, and the other 95% ends up with the power company. It really begs the question of, is buying voluntary green energy doing more harm or good? Are you really promoting green power projects, or are you just shoring up the bottom line of a utility whose primary business is not to be green, just by nature of them being in the industry? Skip this slide. So what we're going to do is look at some case studies of community solar projects and kind of see where they fit in to these to the existing system. So, community solar projects are entering this rec market where you have the ability to sign up for a green power plan from your utility. There are state mandates for green power. Most of the states don't have very much teeth, but there is a market for it. And so it's like, okay, well, a customer is willing to spend $15 a rec, but if I go and try and sell my RECs, power companies will only give me less than $1 for them. But then those same power companies will turn around and sell the RECs to their customers for $15. So, and that may or may not be a very good product for the customer who's buying them. Now, how does community solar come in and fit into this context? Well, let's look at some case studies. So I did some research. I'm trying to talk to customers who participate in community solar programs, say, why do they do it? Well, maybe it's just because I'm from Mississippi, or I'm not from Mississippi. I'm living in Mississippi. Maybe I'm just ragging on Alabama just from some friendly state-to-state rivalry here. The very first community solar project that was proposed in Alabama did not make it out of the ethics committee. The same Public Utility Service Commissioner who voted against net metering in Alabama said, well, I want to lease out my family land for the state's first community solar project. And he didn't consider that to be a conflict of interest. In fact, the next year, there was a failed proposal in the Alabama state legislature to exempt economic development projects from the ethics committee that rejected this same community solar project because it enriched the public service commissioner, who on the one hand was striking down community consumer-owned solar rights in the state, but also controlling how community solar came to market and leasing the land out for it. So that didn't. Let's just move on to the next case study. That's not a very good one. So here is Middleburg, Tennessee Electric Co-op, and they're on a regulated grid. They're on the TVA grid. And they said, okay, well, the TVA has a standard offer. And at the time of this program, the standard offer, they actually had applied in the 2015 program, and it was 8 cents a kilowatt hour for a 1 megawatt array. And so this co-op said, okay, well, why don't we turn it into a community solar project? Because we have we can buy, as a co-op, we can go in and buy a 1 megawatt plant, and then we can subdivide it off, get our money back, cash out the original investor by divvying it up as a community solar project and offering it to our customers. And so, that's actually, they were proactive about it, and they said, we don't have the best solar net metering options for our customers, but why don't we get some good publicity and do a community solar project? So they announced a 1 megawatt project, and kind of what got it off the ground was their regulated utility at the time. Way back here, it was just very simple. Their regulated utility was offering a standard offer of 8 cents a kilowatt hour, and so they took it, and it was one cooperative, but then they went and added a community solar layer onto it. So we're going to talk about that structuring in a little bit. It's a pretty good one. What was interesting is when this article broke, I called them up to talk to them about their community solar details, and they didn't know. We don't know how much it'll cost. We don't know how much the credit will be. We've already started building the project. It's going to be built, but what we do know is that it's going to be a community solar project. And so in their case, they already had the contract in hand to secure the purchase of the electricity, and then they were going to add a community solar layer to it after the project was built. That's a little bit different than what goes on in Minnesota. So here's Minnesota has some legislation for community solar. And let me just skip ahead here, see if I get to the desired page for it. So if you go to Minnesota and you look up their solar programs, they have something called the value of solar tariff. And what the value of solar tariff is a, why don't we just go to Desire and get the most up-to-date information. So here's Minnesota's value of solar tariff. And it's for solar PV. Kind of applies largely across the board. Only to investor-owned utilities, not to electric cooperatives, for a 1 megawatt system. And it defines right here that the utility owns the RECs. So to participate in this value of solar tariff, the utility gets the renewable energy credits. And I don't know how up to date this Desire page was. It looks like been updated. All right, it's updated in 2015. So no utilities had gone for it yet, but it's a tariff that's adopted in lieu of net metering. And so it's a rate structure that Minnesota, I think they have a net metering law on the books. Yeah, here they do. They say we have net metering, and so they're already anticipating. Their net metering is no limit, reconciled monthly. Customer owns the RECs. They're already kind of anticipating kind of an unfairness in the net metering policy, or a battle in the net metering policy. And so what they're doing is giving their utilities a way to opt out of net metering, kind of nipping the conversation in the bud to say, well, if you don't want to give your customers net metering, you can give them this value of solar tariff instead. And what Minnesota did is their value of solar tariff was kind of interesting. They said it cannot be less than retail net metering for 3 years, but it can be a 20-year contract. So initially, the value of solar of tariff has to be retail price, but eventually it can drop down below retail price. That's just for Minnesota. Now, generally speaking, these value of solar tariffs are going to be something that is lower than retail price, but something that's more than avoided cost. Kind of like what we saw earlier with Reliant Energy offering their solar customers for solar outflow without any of this regulation, something that's more than avoided cost, but something that's less than retail price. And then they say there's a community solar garden extension of this that says the utility solar garden rate has to be at the value of solar tariff rate if approved by the utility, plus an adder for the renewable energy certificate. So none of that might have just kind of zoomed by. That's okay. It'll make a little more sense when we actually see how the compensation works under these programs. So we have Geronimo Energy selling 66 megawatts of community solar projects to Berkshire Hathaway. I'd like to develop, and it says projects spread across 21 locations across 16 Minnesota counties. Now, 66 megawatts is nothing to sneeze at. So how did these projects get developed? Going to the Geronimo website and seeing how they're marketed, they tell their customers there's no upfront investment. You just sign up. You get annual energy savings. Okay, so it sounds like I'm saving money. Enjoy the security of the financial backing of Berkshire Hathaway Renewables. And that's good. If I go and I buy a bond in Mosaic or a bond in Solar City, I run a big risk to say, well, is my bond backing the company or a specific project? What happens if the project fails? Do I still get paid? What happens if the company fails? Do I still get paid? So it is good to have, some security in your community solar project, especially because a lot of the economic benefits for the participant, as we'll learn, they don't really occur until later on into that 20-year contract. So you might be paying more upfront and then you might get savings later. And if the company's not around later, you don't want to be a chump. You're supporting renewable energy, and then they're like, and increasing brand loyalty and overall value. Well, if I'm an individual, I don't really care too much about my brand loyalty or overall value, um, unless I'm single in my young 20s. I'm not really trying to really promote my individual person brand. So, that's obviously marketed more for corporations to say, you might get Whole Foods saying we're 100% solar powered, or, instead Whole Foods might say we participate in the local community solar program. They keep stressing the local dollars local, although I wouldn't consider Berkshire Hathaway to be a local company. No maintenance or overhead, so that's one thing that's nice, is you might have a longer payback on a community solar buy-in option. You might have less value on community solar than consumer-owned solar, but you don't have to do any work, so that's nice. And then they reiterate how solid Berkshire Hathaway is as a company, and I would agree with that. But still, very lacking in detail on how much it costs, what does it pay, what are the details, is that really right for me? So I emailed them to get more information, and immediately the director of marketing came back and said, we're not going to tell you anything about our program. Well, they're building a big giant solar array that gets a 30% federal tax credit that comes out of our government tax dollars. So, we have a private company that's now not providing any information on their product offering, but they are taking that tax credit. I guess that's just reality. Well, very soon after, their director of marketing sent me an email. Their VP of business development sent me an email just to reiterate that out of protection for customer privacy, they're not going to tell me anything about their program. That's not very helpful. Like, hey, if you were an actual customer of ours, or potential customer, we'd tell you everything about the program. But you're in Mississippi, we're in Minnesota, we're not going to tell you anything about what we're doing. All right, well, I'll go online and talk to some of their customers and figure out what their program details are. That's not too hard to do. So here's a sidestep. This is not the Berkshire Hathaway project. We're going to come back to that. This is Geronimo and Berkshire Hathaway. This is a competitor of theirs, and it's called SunShare. So they're active in Minnesota, and they offer what they call a pay-as-you-go contract, where this customer, Burr, would pay SunShare 13 cents a kilowatt hour through his subscription, with the rate increasing slightly each year over 25 years. So this community solar option, finally we're getting into some brass tacks. This participant is going to pay 13 cents a kilowatt hour with a guaranteed rate escalator for 25 years for his electricity. And whatever he pays into that at 13 cents for 25 years, it'll be subtracted dollar for dollar off of his regular power bill. And so he might not even need to do 100% of his bill through community solar. He might just do half of his bill at 13 cents a kilowatt hour, and that half would escalate at 25 cents a year. And if he's paying a bill of $100 a month into his community solar account, he gets a $100 a month credit off of his bill. And so then it says SunShare projects it's going to be cheaper from the grid. Well, project, doesn't that mean in the future? Does that mean in the first couple of years he's not saving anything, but then maybe down the road he is? And so then he says he's going to be saving between $5 to $50 a month over the life of the contract. Okay, well, is that does that start? Is he immediately saving $5 to $50 a month, or is initially he's paying $100 a month, and then down the road he's saving $110 a month? So what's actually going on here? Well, anyway, to the customer, it sounded like something he was interested in, so he paid his subscription fee, and then he saw no change to his bill. So he said, "What's going on?" And it turned out the project hadn't been built yet. And so the reason why I point that out is here's a case where they're signing up customers ahead of the project, whereas in Middleburg, Tennessee, we saw they already had the power purchasing agreement in place, ironclad with the TVA, and so they could go ahead and develop the project with a starting investor and then sign up the customers after the fact. So I'm trying to do more research on the Minnesota community solar offering. We saw that one of the competitors is offering basically 13 cents a kilowatt hour with a rate escalator. I go onto a chat room, I find a customer who's participating in the Geronimo project, and so I asked him a few questions. He says, well, we just signed up. It's actually cheaper than retail if you're already paying for wind source, which many of us were. And I think this is one of the most revealing aspects of who participates in community solar, because what we're about to learn is that Minnesota's community solar program, in fact, will increase the cost of electricity for the participant, unless they were already part of that 2% of the U.S. who voluntarily purchases renewable energy, at which point it seemed to be a better deal than that REC program. So if I'm an Alabama Power customer and I'm paying $0.015 a kilowatt hour already to increase the cost of my electricity to be green, and then the community solar program comes in and it also increases the cost of electricity by $0.015, I'm going to look at that community solar program and say, well, it costs the same as what I'm already paying. So rather than doing the wind-based voluntary green power purchasing, I'd rather do that local community solar program. It's the same price, so why not go ahead and do that instead? So there's going to be some customers out there, I'd say most customers, who sign up for your community solar program and it's actually raising their electric bill, although some customers might say it's not because they're already used to paying for that premium. So he says Berkshire Hathaway's facilities, this customer, I guess, doesn't care about the customer privacy of what he's paying. He's very willing to share it. He says it's a 25-year agreement. After the agreement, that's it. You don't get any residual claim in the array asset or anything like that. If you move, they terminate your agreement without penalty. That's a little sneaky. We're going to get into that in a minute. If you don't own the home anymore, if you die, you get out of your contract. But if you abandon your contract without clause, there is an early termination fee, but it's flexible. It depends on what the market conditions are at the time. And I would say for the same reason that they're enabling you to terminate the penalty pretty easily if there's a real reason for it, they're also not so inclined to charge you a fee if you terminate without clause. And what we'll realize is that's because the profit of the program is made by the company on the front end, and then they start to lose money on the back end. For the customer, it's the opposite. They pay a little bit more on the front end, and then they start to save money on the back end. And so, that kind of explains why the power company would be more than happy to, if you're 10 years into your agreement, to let you out of your contract without penalty, because they've already made all their money and they'll start losing money if you continue to stay into the system. For that matter, we have to keep in mind that this community solar program is not something that you can take with you. If you move within 25 years, you may not receive the value of the program because you'll terminate your agreement. So that offsite ownership may not be quite as valuable as it can appear to be. So what this customer then says is, hey, I may end up saving $10,000 over 25 years, or I may end up paying just a little bit more to offset my electric use. Well, I think there's a pretty big disparity between saving $10,000 or paying a little bit more on your electric bill. I'd love to be able to sell solar arrays to customers and say, well, it may cost you money, but you may save $10,000. I say, well, what happens to your renewable energy credits? If he's on wind source already, he's on that green power purchasing plan, and that means he gets to keep his renewable energy credits. So does he get to keep his renewable energy credits on this cost equivalent community solar program? And his response kind of indicated to me that he didn't really know what I was talking about. And that's fair. And he says, well, you don't own any of the panels. You're simply agreeing to buy the power from the array at the rate. We saw in the previous example, it was that you're agreeing to buy the power at 13 cents a kilowatt hour and have it increase a little bit each year. And so any credits or subsidies or tax credits or renewable energy credits go to the company, and that allows them to give you the rate that they're providing. Okay, well, that didn't really address the renewable energy credit. So I asked him again, and he said, well, actually, the contract states all of the RECs are assigned to the power company. And the subscriber agrees that the community solar garden operator has the ability to assign all of the mineral rights, all of the environmental attributes of the array to a third party, and that all of the energy produced and associated with the subscriber share are going to belong to that third party. So that's kind of interesting that legally the community solar participant is not allowed to claim that they're solar powered because that solar environmental attribute is being monetized by a third party. Whereas if they had signed up for the wind source program, they would be able to claim that they are powered by renewables because they own the renewable energy credit. They say, well, that doesn't seem to be much of a concern to this customer on if he actually owns the renewable energy credit. But it does beg a question. If the utility is mandated to buy renewable energy credits and you have voluntary customers instead paying for the project and then giving the renewable energy credits to the power company, aren't you kind of paying the environmental tab for the power company if that's the case? Because they would be mandated to buy these things, but now they don't have to buy them because their own customers are buying them and then turning around and giving them to the power company. So aren't you kind of, you're not robbing Peter to pay Paul. Peter is paying Paul's bar tab voluntarily. And so if you're really in the business of improving the environment, wouldn't it be better to let Paul pay his own bar tab and then you go and put your money into other environmental efforts? Wouldn't that seem to be do the most? And he says, well, it's not about that. I'm not, what I'm trying to do is see a local solar project occur in my area and feel like I'm involved in it. I'm not trying to optimize my environmental awareness. I'm not trying to save $10,000 over the long run. What he says, I didn't know that the power company would be forced to buy these green credits, but, what's the big deal? Uh, so he said some additional stuff, um, but he really didn't seem to have a problem with that, is what I'm trying to say. The state wants to promote renewables, the power company's on board, and I want to be on board too. And I said, well, what about that you might increase your electric bill or you might save $10,000? Generally, that's marketed as a hedge, where if you're locking in your rate at 13 cents and having it escalate just by a defined amount every year, you're hedging the value of your electricity. So how much of that incentivizes the customer to participate? I always hear that as like, oh, and solar hedges your electricity prices. Well, actually, most customers want to do solar to not pay their electric bill. That whether or not they make money off the array or not, what they're really focused on is not paying their electric bill. It might cost them $150 a month to save $125. They don't look at it as a hedge. They don't look at it as an investment. They look at it as getting rid of a bill. And this customer is saying, I don't really care about the hedge. It's rate stabilization is not why I'm doing this. Even if it ends up costing me a little bit more money, whatever, I still would have done it. It's more local than wind source, and it's promoting solar, and it makes me feel like I'm doing something, and so that's why I'm doing it. And so I think that made a pretty good profile of this customer. This is a customer who would normally be buying the wind green power purchase option, but he has, even without knowing any of the details or the mechanisms behind it, he kind of has this suspicion that the community solar project that he can actually see and touch is a better deal than the wind renewable energy credit program, even though technically speaking, the wind program gives them the REC and the solar program doesn't. He has this suspicion that there's something rotten about REC ownership in the voluntary market. And that's kind of what we saw previously, where, yeah, you could buy the REC for $1, but maybe only 5 cents of it ends up at the project. And then that project is 1,000 miles away, and there's no paper trail transaction to make sure that the REC is being, doubly counted. He says, I don't care about any of that REC stuff. I want to see my project, and the solar program is more local than the wind program. And so I would put forth that as kind of evidence that the real kind of the early market for community solar is going after that 2% of the population that would voluntarily purchase green power anyway. That those customers are particularly interested in community solar, and kind of what that implies is that at a bare minimum, community solar could be about 2% of your electric grid's projects before you start to really have to find additional buyers or offer better deals to the participants. Yeah, Robert, we're gonna take a break in a minute. Let's see what it's 1:24. We started at. Did I lose track of time here? Yeah. Well, what we're gonna do is I don't know. I might be a little bit further on. Yeah, we're gonna pick up the speed, Robert. You know, And since I'm a little kind of lost on my time, let me finish out this case study, and then we'll take a break. So I asked him what his contract was like, and his contract was actually at 14 cents a kilowatt hour for a 20-year contract, rather than 13 cents with a small rate escalator over 25 years. But they're in the same group. And so what we want to see is that the community solar project is 14 cents for 20 years. The customers risk buying a premium for 20 years. And the reason why I say that is you go and you pull up electric rate prices in Minnesota, and their electric rates are around 9 cents in the summer, 8 cents in the winter, plus a 3 cent energy charge. So they're paying around 12 cents a kilowatt hour right now. And what these customers are doing is saying, okay, well, increase my electric bill from 12 cents a kilowatt hour, increase it to 13 cents, or increase it to 14 cents, and I guarantee I'm going to pay that for 20 to 25 years as long as I stay in my service territory. And so if you just take a step back as a utility provider, you say, I don't know how I feel about solar. Don't think of it like solar. Think of it like, well, renewables are disrupting the electric grid. There's concerns that renewables are going to lower the price of electricity so much that your existing infrastructure is never going to get paid back and you're going to go broke. That's the fear of the current stakeholders in the energy sector. That might be a good thing for consumers to have an overabundance of below retail price, cheap, clean electricity. But like the TVA says, solar is growing so fast and we don't have the same population growth in our area. And so we don't need it. We don't need this new power coming to the grid. And that would kind of assume that you're not really caring about the environmental discussion. And for a utility manager, let's put aside the environmental discussion and say, if you have a customer that is right now willing to commit to a 20 to 25 year purchase contract and increase their rate by 15 to 20%, would you take it? And across the board, the answer is going to be yeah. That's the customer we want, the one that is happy to increase their electric bill and not leave us for 20 to 25 years. Do those customers really exist? Because what the utility manager is used to is proposing a 15% rate increase and then getting protests the next day lasting for months and months at the Public Utility Commission's doorstep. It's tough to get rate riders through, and yet all of a sudden we have all these customers who are willing to increase the price of their electricity voluntarily. In fact, you look at the programs of let's say your inflation is 3% and your very slight escalator is 2%. So it is a hedge. You're increasing your rate today to try and get a lower rate tomorrow by locking in that rate escalator at below the value of inflation. Now, traditionally, electricity only increases by about 1.6 to 2% a year. Generally, electricity only increases below inflation, not above inflation. We have cheap electricity in the US. Maybe renewables are going to upset that trend. So what's very interesting about Minnesota's program is they have kind of a path towards getting rid of net metering. They have a tariff that's available to get customers off net metering. And then looking at some of their other programs. Looking at their community-based energy development program, they say each public utility in Minnesota is required to file a tariff for a 20-year power purchase agreement for community-owned renewable projects. The rate must be higher in the first 10 years than it is in the last 10 years. The intent is to provide renewable energy projects with better cash flow for the first 10 years and then lower the rate over the second 10 years. The projects are required to be 5 megawatts or less. There is a buy-in that says 51% of the revenues must flow to Minnesota-based owners and local qualifying entities. All owners of the property, yada, yada. You know, what they've done in Minnesota is basically approved a tariff for community solar projects and said that the rate can be higher in the first 10 years and lower in the last 10 years, and every utility has to have this rate. And then investors have come back and said, okay, well, that means that we can go and build a project and have a rate structure for the project where we get a higher rate on the front end and a lower rate on the back end. And all we really need is someone to commit to compensating us for that rate. And so we're allowed in Minnesota to build a power plant and write our own power purchase agreement to where we get not even 4 cents or 5 cents like on a utility scale project, or even 12 cents like a net metered residential project. We can actually get 14 cents as an approved rate structure from the state for our solar project. The only trick is that we have to find the buyers. And so this is what all of this is doing. This is why Mr. Burr did not, signed up for a program only to discover that the project hadn't been built yet, is because Mr. Burr, he's signing up because he's willing to pay the 13 or 14 cents today, knowing that the rate structure down the road is a guaranteed hedge, which may or may not end up saving him money. Now, $50 a month, I doubt it. In my assessments, looking at the rate escalators and stuff, it actually will result in a net present value loss to the customer, and you don't really break even until year 16 or so. So none of these customers who are participating in this community solar projects are going to end up saving any money. But they are locking in their rates, and solar is expensive, and they would normally be paying more for wind choice and stuff like that. And the kind of the beauty of the Minnesota program is it legalizes the ability for an investor to come in, build a 2 megawatt solar project, and receive 14 cents a kilowatt hour for 20 to 25 years from that, as long as the projects are less than 5 megawatts. And that kind of explains why the Berkshire Hathaway proposal is set to 66 megawatts over 21 locations. So all of the projects are less than 5 megawatts. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute or about a 12-minute break. So it is 1:34 Central Time now. Why don't we take a 11-minute break and pick back up at a quarter till, and then we'll talk through two other structures of community solar that are a little bit different than the Minnesota model, and then we'll wrap it up with how to create your own model discussion at the end of the program. So we are gonna now it's just the program is set to end at 2:15. So it is gonna kind of pick up some speed for the last half an hour, and we'll take your suggestion, Robert, of we'll just introduce the other structures and then get back into how to create your own program, and then with the remaining time might go back and talk about some of the nuances. But I think we've painted the picture. Let's take our break, another 10 minutes or so. We'll pick back up at a quarter till. We got 2 minutes left, so we'll just pick up in a minute or so. All right, welcome back. As we're waiting for people to get back, I sent out a link to my Slack group. I would prefer that you join my Slack and use the Slack community to get access to the course videos and do instructor interaction, mainly because I have solar installers and other audience members in that group. And so, I'm interested in what kind of discussions result in it. And it's a kind of a closed environment group. It's good for networking. If you're in a particular region, I might know an installer who's in the group and refer you to them. Just keep things simple and easy. Let's get back into the program. I'm going to quickly talk through a couple of different other structures of community solar. This last one that we saw was called pay as you go, which basically there's an electric rate that you're going to get for participating in the program. And what we saw in Minnesota's case is that rate was higher than the average amount of electricity. Now in New York, they have net metering, and just in the interest of time, we're gonna kind of glaze over this. But again, you use the Desire website to go into your own state and research net metering, renewable portfolio standards, any community solar legislation. And so they have pay as you go community solar offerings that lock in a rate for 15 or 20 or 25 years. And then you get to a company called Roofless Solar, which instead of giving you a rate to opt into, they'll actually let you buy a dollar per watt block of solar panels and receive payment from it. So that's like traditional solar array ownership, where you pay up front and then you get a true credit on your bill. Whereas in the previous example, you're paying your community solar bill like you would normally pay your electric bill, and then just hoping that the community solar rate is more economically advantaged than your normal rate. Whereas the roofless solar is selling, more like upfront solar ownership. And they say the payback is between 5 to 15 years. Now, and you get some kind of feel goods that come along with it. And so I asked them what their typical payback was, and they say, well, typically it's around 12 and a half years under a 20-year agreement. And basically what it is you buy in at a price that's similar to a solar array, you get what is similar to retail price net metering for it. So it's almost just like you bought the solar array and put it on your rooftop and you have net metering and you get that retail credit, but the array is located off site. And the payback is about 12 and a half years. Then again, you're not doing any management, you're not putting up the real estate, no one's poking any holes in your roof, and the utility gets to keep the renewable energy credit, which is interesting because New York is a state that may value renewable energy credits, and they don't do it as, I say may because they just don't do it as aggressively as others, but they do have a number of solar subsidies. So one way or another, the utilities need these things. And if I was a customer and I did net metering, usually I get to keep the renewable energy credit. So, off the bat, it looks like their community solar program is equivalent to the customer buying solar and putting on their roof. The only difference being the utility gets to keep the REC rather than the customer. And so right off the bat, the utility has an economic motive to get all their customers into community solar rather than owning the solar themselves, because under the community solar option, the utility gets to keep the REC, which in New York is valuable. Now, if the REC isn't valuable, then there needs to be a little bit more profit motive for the utility. And in fact, I would argue that the utility needs a little bit more profit motive than this. So how does this model work? Well, it goes back to, what does solar look like in your state? In New York, they have very high electricity pricing, and they have rather substantial local solar incentives. And so you do solar in New York, and you're typically getting a 4 to 8 year payback because of all the subsidies. And so under the community solar program with a 12-year payback, you're actually getting a worse payback than if you put solar on your own rooftop. But you don't have to do any of the work, and maybe you don't have the rooftop for it. But it looks very much like a residential purchase in terms of the buy-in, but it's a utility scale project. And so if the utility scale project can be installed for half the cost of the residential project or even less, but you're paying for it like it's a residential project, and you're getting cash flow that is like a residential project or maybe even a little bit worse, what that means is there's a big margin in there that's up for grabs. And so the project developer, instead of installing 100 different projects as a residential installer, can go and do one big solar project, sell it at residential pricing, install it at utility scale costs, and maybe split some of that profit with the utility who opens up their Rolodex of customers. And so the utility at that point would say, how do we become a solar installer? And the answer is, well, let's develop community scale, utility scale solar projects as community solar and sell them at residential market pricing and credit them like residential project net metering. But that way we get the profit rather than the solar installer. And so in this case, in the roofless solar model, the utility scale developer and utility partner, they're biting the bullet and saying, we're going to lose our revenue to these residential solar owners unless we develop a competitive product. We have the golden Rolodex. We have the financial capacity to do a large project. So let's just make our community solar project seem like residential ownership and offer it as a competitive option to anyone who wants to put solar on their roof. Instead, they buy into the community solar project, and that's the way we get to keep the profit made off of the project, at least. And so finally, we get to a Massachusetts model, which is a community solar project that everyone thinks is like what community solar should be like, and at the same time, it also sounds too good to be true, where you literally just pick up the phone, call the community solar company, and they say, well, okay, you're signed up, and you'll start saving 5 to 10% on your electric bill immediately. So unlike in Minnesota, where your electric bill is increasing by 16% or more, in Massachusetts, there's a plan where you can immediately start saving money. But the only reason why this works in Massachusetts is because their REC prices are so high. So when your renewable energy credits are trading at 3 to 4 times the retail price of electricity, the retail price of electricity doesn't really matter anymore. And so they can get a customer and say, look, you're paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour for your electricity. Sign up for our community solar project and give us the money or sign up for the community solar project, and we'll immediately knock your rate down from 20 cents down to 16 cents. And so the customer, they're like, wow, that's a great deal. But what it does is it enables the developer to go to the state utility commission and say, we have 1,000 customers who are subscribed to our community solar project for 20 years. So let's greenlight it and build it. And they do. And then the developer's profit is really coming from the renewable energy credit market rather than anything else. So, I guess because there's a lot of subsidies and high electricity pricing to begin with in Massachusetts, they have a little bit more budget flexibility to cut the customer in. If you're in a middle of the United States market where the retail price of electricity is only 11 cents a kilowatt hour and there's no renewable energy credit market to be had, you can't do something like what they've done in Massachusetts, which is a literal call the company, switch to community solar, and start saving money. And so that brings us to the Michigan model, which is a hybrid between the two. And so in Michigan, you have a couple of different options. The first option is to simply buy 500 watts of solar and get a credit on your rate. So that's like the New York roofless solar model. It's very similar to owning solar on your own roof. It's just made off site. So you buy it and then they credit you. The other option is pay as you go. So literally, it's a little hard to find on the slide, but you got 4 options to get this 500 watt block of solar. You can either pay $1,300 up front, or you can pay $40 a month over 3 years, $20 a month over 7 years, or $10 a month over 25 years to get that 500 watt block and that 500 watt credit. The thing is, if you go and you spend $10 a month over 25 years, the 500 watt of solar may only result in a $5 a month billing credit. So what you've effectively done is increased your electric bill by $5 a month to support a local solar project. But if you actually want to get a payback for it, you can do the upfront lump sum. That gives them the capital to go build the project, and then that gets you, something that might give you a return on investment. So if we look at the math a little bit harder, what they're doing is selling the array, and then there's the effect of the 30% tax credit. The Michigan model is basically the utility offering solar at $3.60 a watt. And instead of putting it on the roof, they go put it off-site. And so instead of building it for $2 a watt, they go and build it for $1 a watt, and they make more money that way. And they get to keep control of their grid and not lose their business, as we've talked before. At $10 a month, though, if you went for the $10 a month plan, that 500 watts of solar would produce about 50 kilowatt hours a month that you're paying $10 for. So you're effectively, spending 19 cents a kilowatt hour for that electricity, and the retail price of electricity in Michigan is 15 cents. So, you can either go with the upfront plan where you give the utility $1,300 and they go build a solar project and you get that 15-cent credit from it, or you can spend $10 a month and you're not making any money, but you're still participating in the program. In fact, you're increasing the premium. And what I think is interesting about the Michigan model is that they also have an option where you're actually getting the renewable energy credit for your buy-in. You're actually getting the renewable energy credit for your $1,300 or your $10 a month. And then they'll offer a secondary service where they will be your rec broker and then go and sell your rec. So potentially, if you're if you're this customer doing the $10 a month, getting the 52 kilowatt hours of RECs, you're increasing your bill by a rather healthy premium, but maybe you get some money back because the utility is going to be in a better position to sell the REC for you. Maybe they need it and they buy it from you. Maybe they find a third-party buyer, but it's something to take a look at. In the interest of time, though, let's just continue on forward. And we'll come back to this. So then we get into designing your own community solar program. And there's a couple of things that you used to be needing to be concerned about. The IRS has offered some guidance on this to say, no, it's okay. But the concern was, if I'm a private developer and I'm offering a 20-year buy-in to community solar, and that guarantees them to the revenue produced by that array for that section that they're buying in over 20 years, how is that really any different than an annuity? And am I going to get regulated by the SEC for it? And the line that's kind of been drawn down the middle is saying, as long as the customer is only buying in to offset their electric bill, they're not a typical investor. And it's almost funny, the justification for not regulating community solar like a security is that it doesn't pay as much as a security. In fact, the customer might lose money. So they're not profit motive. There's no profit motive like an investor might be. And I think that also sets it up for a weakness that says, well, if you create a profitable community solar program, then you actually might get regulated by the SEC. A utility doesn't really have that problem. They're already regulated by the Public Utility Commission. So, they are subject to a little bit less regulation than a private community solar operator. So in this class, I recommend structuring the community buy-ins as equipment operating leases or capital leases, much like a solar leasing company does, in order to as your framework for your community solar buy-in. So not just, there's there's one company out there that will pay your electric bill and let you buy into a community solar project and guarantee you a payback over a certain number of years. And it's not very good. It's like a 0% return on investment. So I don't really recommend doing it. But the reason why they wouldn't be regulated by the SEC is because they're not really providing a return on investment, and that's no fun. If you want your community solar members to make money profitably, then the one rule to follow is to make sure the investors are not buying in for more than what their electric bill is, so that their motivation is to eliminate their electric bill. If their motivation is to invest and make money off their investment, then you're going to run afoul of SEC regulations. And so that's why I would recommend a equipment leasing agreement instead of just a pure, hey, give us money and we'll give you back money kind of arrangement. So what we see from these case studies is, by and large, the community solar model is one that is a long-term contract, a 20-year, 25-year contract, where the customer is going to agree to change their electric rate somewhere from decreasing it by 10% to increasing it by 20% under a 20-year contract with standard termination fees, where you're not allowed to terminate it unless you move or die. You can't just terminate for no cause, with the utility keeping the RECs. And you have to be careful with your marketing material so that you're not, so that the customer understands that they're not being powered by the community solar project. The REC is being claimed by the utility. And then there's a competitive advantage of bringing a utility partner on board in that they have the golden Rolodex of customers. And so either by incentivizing the utility by cutting them in on the profit, or incentivizing the utility by allowing them to keep the RECs, those are the two strategies that we see community solars bringing in the utility partner on. And the elegance of having a utility partner is that there's less work that you have to do, because the utility can advertise it to their members, and then the utility can credit the bill to the members through digital metering, etc. Then again, your utility might tell you, oh, we don't want to participate. And so, generally what we see is that the utility receives the RECs, administers the program, and then there may be a fee that they charge to the developer. And the developer puts the project together. They find the site, do the maintenance, and kind of operate the plant, structure the arrangements so that the plant owner gets the tax credits. And the utility generally will not have the tax appetite for the credits. And so just as an example, let's say you're looking at a install cost of $2.50 a watt, and take the tax credit effect. So your install cost is $1.75 a watt. And then let's say you sign up customers for 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and your array produces so much. The project payback in this case is going to be kind of similar to residential ownership at an 11-year payback, net present value of 75 cents a watt. And so this is where like a developer would come in and get a power purchase agreement for 12 cents and get an 11-year payback. And so then the next choice is, well, am I going to hold on to the array over the long term and get that 11-year payback? Or am I going to try and cash out and get my net present value out of the project by selling my ownership stake to someone else who's less motivated by profit? So you don't actually need a utility buy-in to develop a community solar project. I mean, what if you just want to go and do a commercial project on top of a commercial facility, but the commercial array owner doesn't really want to isn't really motivated by, a long-term payback, or doesn't really want to take out a loan. If I'm getting an 11-year payback, I might have to take out a 20-year loan to make this profit. Is there a way that I can cash myself out of the loan or transfer the loan to someone else, maybe at better terms for me and worse terms for the person taking over the loan? And so that's what a community solar project would be looking like at the private level. Is you go and you put in a big commercial solar array and solar battery behind the meter for like a commercial property, and then you convert it into a community solar project. And usually a capital investor wants a better payback than what a individual buyer wants. We've seen these individual buyers who are willing to increase their electric bill to do community solar. So let's just call it as community solar is like a 20-year 0% interest loan financing for your project. That is what a developer might need to make their project cash flow. So how do we go about converting a short an upfront cash deal into one where thousands of people come in and voluntarily provide a 0% interest long-term loan for the project? So what you might want to do is consider equipment leasing. It's a pretty straightforward structure. There's two different kinds of equipment leasing. There's operating leases and there's capital leases. It reminds me of the Monty Python skit where the doctor says, we leased the equipment back from the company we sold it to, and that way it shows up on, doesn't show up on the balance sheet. And it's like, well, there's two different leases. There's a capital lease and an operating lease. A capital lease is basically a loan where, for all intents and purposes, the leasee, the one who's making the loan payments, is the owner of the system. They're going to claim the tax credits. They're going to claim the depreciation. And at the end of the lease, the equipment is usually bought for below market value, like $1. So whenever there's a lease agreement where there's a buyout for $1 at the end of the lease term, that's a capital lease. An operating lease is something that's more like a Solar City lease or a Sunrun lease, where at the end of your lease term, the developer agrees to either reissue the new lease or come and remove the property or sell the property to the owner at fair market value, which, granted, a 20-year-old solar array may not be worth very much. It's probably worth more than $1. And there's certain rules, accounting rules, that govern operating leases. But for this purpose, the key point is that an operating lease, the lease owner, the one who is receiving the payments, not the one who's making the payments, but the lease owner is the owner of the asset. So they're the ones claiming the depreciation and the tax credits. So depending on whether or not you need the site host or the developer or the lender, they may not have the tax appetite for the tax credits, at which point, you wouldn't want them to issue an operating lease because they would be claiming the depreciation and the tax credits. Instead, you'd want it to be a capital lease. And so, basically, we had this situation in Mississippi where the TVA came back and said, our new program for this year is community solar, and you need to create your own community solar project in order to get our 6 cent a kilowatt hour standing offer PPA. And so we had a sponsor with the land saying, well, I want to do solar, and I would buy the array at 6 cents a kilowatt hour and install it and sell the utility 6 cents a kilowatt hour for 20 years. But it's not a great, it's not something I'm very excited about. how do I hedge my investment? How do I convert this into a community solar project? And so that might be if he can come in and take the tax credits and depreciation, he would simply go and do an operating lease for 20 years to the individual members. And so the operating lease terms could be either pay as you go, i.e., a monthly lease payment of $10 a month, $100 a month, depending on the size of your buy-in, or it could actually be a capital lease where the individual owner or it could be an operating lease where they put the money up front and then just get a lease payment back. And so they pay the prime sponsor in a lump term, and the prime sponsor goes around and gets payments from the utility and then pays that back to the individual. And whether or not it's a capital lease or an operating lease can transfer tax credits and depreciation away from the sponsor and into the individual buyer. Although, when you're transferring under a capital lease, when you're transferring the tax credits and depreciation, you're actually transferring the ownership. So you have to be a little careful. If you're trying to offload the tax credits and depreciation to a third party, you have to be willing to let that third party own that section of the panels. And that means that at the end of the term, if you wanted to renegotiate the deal, they're going to either come along with you or you're going to have to buy them out at fair market value. So, by understanding not solar leases or PPAs, but having your accountant understand the nuances between an operating lease or a capital lease, basically the original buyer of the array becomes the underwriter. And then the original buyer, rather than waiting 11 years to get their payback, can choose to get their money back through either operating leases with down payments or capital leases with down payments, or they can do a pay as you go where there is no down payment, but the individual members agree to offtake or hedge the price of the electricity that comes out of that asset. And it's like, well, aren't we creating a lot of busy work for ourselves to do that? So I've kind of diagrammed a couple of ways that cash flows can come out of that. A very common structure for utility scale projects is inverted lease structures. I don't fully understand them, but effectively a tax equity investor comes in for the depreciation term. It's about 7 years with accelerated depreciation, and then the ownership flips to the developer. But the reason why all this is important is the commercial solar market. And I think this slide isn't in your program, but I think it's important enough to consider. In the rooftop commercial market, you have giant rooftops that would make great 1 megawatt size solar projects. Or on industrial facilities, you generally have the land and the power to do a 12 megawatt project, not just to say a 1 megawatt project, but your manufacturers may not have the tax appetite to really benefit from solar. Furthermore, batteries are coming to the market and saying, well, let's take that industrial facility that it might need a 10 megawatt solar array to offset its electric bill fully. But really, it's on a peak rate structure where instead of being billed for the volume under this curve, like the kilowatt hour, which is how residential electricity is billed, instead, high demand customers are billed for this maximum demand. And it used to be that solar was not very good for demand charges, but now it's the best market. because solar would only occur during the day, and if that didn't coincide with your period of maximum demand, then solar doesn't do anything for your demand charges. And even when solar coincides with your period of demand, a partly cloudy day, your demand is where it normally is, your solar array is jumping up and down because of the clouds, you might not get any demand savings because your peak is still as before. Well, you combine a solar array and a battery, and what happens is even if your solar array is only doing 10% of your facility energy use, it goes and runs a battery right at peak time when it's needed. And so you're no longer generating average electricity, you're generating peak electricity. And without getting into the math, what I don't even think most in the solar industry realize, this is just drawing from some other course content, is that you take your typical solar production and your typical cost to install a batteryless solar array versus a commercial battery solar array. Let's go and say even that the commercial solar battery costs more despite the economies of scale because it has a battery and the residential customer does not. Generally the residential customer is paying 12 to 15 cents a kilowatt hour for their electricity, and they're getting a 9 to 10 year payback, where solar has a market. You go into demand leveling, demand rate structures, and when you get into demand charges of $10 a kilowatt, which is pretty typical, you can find $20 to $25 a kilowatt. The energy rate plummets, but the demand rate is so high that through doing a smaller solar battery and just running it at peak times, you actually generate a much greater payback. And we get into that in our battery classes. But the point is, you might have an industrial facility that could use a 1 megawatt project with a solar battery and have it be even more cost effective than residential solar. And all it takes is figuring out how to get the funding for the project. And whereas residential solar, it's not too difficult to get 20-year private unconventional loan financing for the arrays. Getting 20-year private unconventional loan financing for a commercial solar battery is still elusive. You could get a 7-year capital equipment loan. And so that would then be the strategy, is have the project developer own the battery, go out and get the 7-year capital equipment loan to finance it, and then offload ownership stakes in the commercial solar battery to residential customers who are willing to sign up for 20-year contracts to purchase the electricity that comes out of it, or to receive credit for the electricity that comes out of it as an upfront payment. Either way, you're securing the financing for the project over a 20 to 25 year term. And so what we see in our case studies is that 20 to 25 year contract that a customer is willing to commit themselves to in order to participate in community solar is another layer that gets added to the project financing to secure the project throughout its useful life. And while it's very easy for a utility project to do that based off the kind of golden Rolodex of their customers, there's really no reason why through the right operating lease or capital lease agreement that a developer can't go and offer operating leases to individual members who come in and do a 20-year, at minimum, a 20-year operating lease. The ownership stays with the developer. The operating lessee gets to lease the asset for 20 years and either pays up front and gets a revenue stream off of that, or pays into it for presumably what will be a credit for its use. And that means the off-taker becomes, that would be the utility would instead be the site host. So an industrial customer comes, says, I want to do a solar array. The developer goes and installs a solar battery and gets payments from the site host for use of the facility. And then the developer turns around and issues a bunch of operating leases to other people who want in. The difference between a stock or a bond is you're not buying a share of that company, you're leasing, a specific group of solar panels associated with that project.
Hey, JR, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you know that we are running on past time right now and do need to wrap up.
We're about to wrap it up. The other very short things to keep in mind is if it's on the ground, consider tracking. Particularly when you get into larger projects, tracking makes sense. I'm strongly considering residential tracking as a design, making my own trackers because they're just not widely available. That's the biggest hurdle for tracking is that it really takes a project that's about 1 megawatt in size in order to buy the cost-effective tracking systems. But tracking is cost-effective when you get into larger projects. So that's one more way to boost the production value from it. Earth screws can get you out of doing concrete. You could consider, instead of having one central inverter for the whole project, which I'm more of a fan of, having done the opposite. But if you subdivide your utility scale community solar project into multiple string inverters, you could actually just make that one string inverter the buy-in block for your community solar project. And so, generally these string inverters have their own independent monitoring systems so that you can give that community solar buy-in, an online monitor that is exactly located to their account so that there's no sharing or common pool of asset ownership between the individual members, which is another way to stay in line with not being regulated by the SEC. They're more concerned about common pools, common sharing. So if you have a community solar project and you can actually assign the owner a specific grouping of panels or even a specific grouping of panels that go into the inverter, that can get you a little bit more breathing room in terms of SEC regulation. So here's some kind of summaries. We saw that Massachusetts had the best program, but they also had the best payback for solar ownership. Minnesota has a longer-term payback in their community for ownership, and their community solar program is not as economic. So I would just caution you to say wherever you see a really good community solar program that's an economic deal for the customer, generally that's also a good market to own solar. If you have a community solar program where it's not a good market to own solar, it's going to end up increasing the customer's money. But it's definitely worth considering as a business model, particularly with industrial facilities that can benefit from solar batteries as a way of cashing out the short-term investors with long-term investors who are motivated not just by return on investment, but also that feeling of helping develop a local solar project, which the current green power products don't provide. So with that, we've reached the end of the program. Sorry I ran a little bit over. If you want more detail on some of the case studies, just send me an email and I'll get you steered in the right direction towards course recordings or more content. So with that, thank you for coming, and I will pass it back to Half Moon.
Thank you, JR. I want to remind everyone to take the quiz after the webinar ends if you need continuing education credit for this webinar. Certificates will be emailed in PDF form, and if you have any remaining questions, you can reply to any emails you have received regarding this seminar or call into our office. Thanks again, JR, for the presentation, and thank you to everyone in attendance. Here's your quiz.